Psalm 85, I'm going to put it up in a moment, is a psalm with a very famous line, famous in terms of art. And check this out. When Napoleon gave as a gift to Pope Pius VII a tiara, he engraved on it verse 11 of today's psalm. Kindness and truth have met, justice and peace have kissed. I'm going to try and spend a little bit more time with rabbinic plays on that verse and the verse after, so more midrash. But of course, we start with the text itself, and we do so knowing that in the Jewish tradition, text is studied on 4 levels, or at least to say there are a variety of levels of unpacking a text. For the rabbis, the phrase they used, a Persian word in its origin, was pardes, paradise. And they saw those 4 consonants as pshat, the literal meaning, remez, the interpretive, drash, a deeper level of interpretation, and sod, the mystical, which is only to say, as you'll see in today's sharing of the psalm, there are different layers of understanding, but we always start with the pshat, which is what are the words themselves, doing so with the recognition that Hebrew words in particular have often more than one possible meaning. And I'll point out the divergence of some of those translations and ambiguity. For instance, the closing line of Psalm 85, I was reassured when I saw scholars like Martin Rosenberg and Bernard Zlotowitz said, and regarding our last verse, Hebrew obscure, which is to say much room for interpretation. With that, I'm going to post the psalm so we can see the words. And as I do, I'll point out, just to help guide, that this psalm is composed of 3 sections, 1 to 4. 1 is just the introduction. And as you know, in like King James Version doesn't count verse 1 as the first verse. So 2, 3, and 4, that's the first section. That you might think of as recollection, looking back. That's the nature of the grammar. It's in the past tense, though Rashi, the great Bible scholar, France, 1040 to 1105, he'll actually see this verses 2 to 4 in the future as a description of the future redemption. But back to Pshat, on the literal level, 2 to 4 looks backwards to a time of closeness to God, in contrast to verses 5 to 8, where there is an angry God, a sense and a request. 5 to 8 is a request for reclaiming of relationship. So it goes from the past to the present. And then verses 9 to the end, 14, look to the future. We don't know when the psalm was written. It's another one of those psalms of the descendants of Korach. But let me begin, and then I'll start from the beginning to take it apart a bit. For the conductor of the descendants of Korach, a psalm. You have favored Adonai, your land. You have restored the restoration of Jacob. You have lifted the iniquity of your people. You have covered over all their sin. You have gathered in all your wrath. You have turned away from the fierceness of your fury. Restore us, God, of our deliverance, and remove your anger against us. Unendingly will you be incensed with us? Will you prolong your fury for generation to generation? Will you restore our lives that your people will rejoice in you? Show us, Adonai, your kindness and your deliverance grant to us. Let me hear what the El Adonai will speak. For God will speak peace to God's people and devotees, that they do not return to folly. Surely, close to those that fear God is God's deliverance, so that glory may dwell in our land. Kindness and truth have met, justice and peace have kissed. Truth from the earth springs forth, and justice from heaven has looked down. Indeed, Adonai will give the good, and our land will give its produce. Justice before God shall walk, as God sets forth a path for God's steps. And so I'll start from the beginning with some analysis, which is the way we do it. And again, my translations tend to lean, when I can, to the word order of the Hebrew and toward the literal, so as to be able to point out the subtleties and the purposefulness of the choice of words of the psalmist. You have faith. So I said at the outset, we don't know when this was written. Some of the medieval commentators will identify it as upon the return from the first exile, when there was a drought and the temple had not yet been built. So that's a popular context. At the same time, there is reference, like in verse 6, to unendingly will you be incensed with us. And so Ibn Ezra, Spain, 1089 to 1167, will see that as referring to the Roman occupation, saying in contrast to the first temple, when we came back within 70 years, here I am in Spain 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple. And so we'll place this psalm as referring and even written after or pointing prophetically to a much later time. There is, for verses 2 to 4, a key word. It actually will occur in verse 5. Key words indicate motifs. There are 4 words in this psalm that appear 4 times. So in verses 2 and 4, the word I translate as restore, shuv, can also be translated as return. That's the key word, occurs 4 times. And here it's the inclusio, it's the frame of 2 to 4. Though the word will occur as well in verse 5. It'll appear a 5th time in the final section, this word return, but it's verse 9, the first word, and that is do not return. So what you get in the first 2 sections are a sense of a movement, of a returning, of a call for restoration. Here, you restored us in verse 2 to 4, 5, 8, restore us again. It can be, in terms of the context of verses 2 to 4, we have a memory in the past of having been restored that we hold on to, even though it was complete. It was not final for this moment of crisis. And then this last section is looking to the future, where things are not in flux, where it's not this cycle of restoration and rejection, but stability. Rashi will point out 4 elements in verses 2 to 4 that are the ingredients of the final redemption. First is return, physically, and then forgiveness and pardon of sin, and last, the withdrawal of anger. One key word to point out in terms of ambiguity is this word in parentheses in verse 2, shvit. There's something called kri and ketiv. Ketiv is how it was originally written, ketiv. Here it was originally written, the second word of the second line of verse 2, as shvut, which is return. And then the Masoretes, which again could be 1,000 years later, who put in the punctuation, not only put in punctuation, but sometimes would say, this word needs a little correction. And so instead of a vav, it should be a yud. Instead of shvut, it's shvit. And here, most commentators translate the word shvit as you have restored the captivity. Shvit, to be a shevi is to be a captive. But as pointed out by more contemporary scholars, that word shvit is also used in some of the writings before, like Amos 9:14. Amos is among the first of the prophets. He lived in the northern Israel kingdom, and that was before the destruction of the temple. There was no captivity, and he used the word shvit to be prosperity, so that translations like Benjamin Siegel will translate shvit as good fortune. Robert Alter will translate it as the condition. I do it as restoration, signifying good fortune and prosperity, to restore what was lost, and to build on this wordplay of shafta shvit, restore the restoration, as a noun. And so I got to keep moving because I really want to hone in on those key verses. But the second section, again, it opens with the word restore. You'll get that again in verse 7. As here, we're asking for God to stop being angry. And we do it with questions. Unendingly, will you be incensed with us? And there are so many different Hebrew words for anger. There's anaf, there's apcha, there is ka'ascha. And so you'll see in my translations words like incensed, fury, anger, different, if you will, dimensions. It's not clear, frankly, what is different about these kinds of anger. Malbim, who'll be writing in 19th century Eastern Europe, he'll say, for instance, regarding in verse 6, that anaf is one shot kind of anger, and apcha is lingering. But that's a way to justify why all these synonyms. And then we say, verse 8, show us, Adonai, your kindness and your deliverance grant us. And that's the bridge to the next section. I will point out back to inclusios, meaning key words to mark. The word yud-he vav-he in verse 2, yud-he vav-he in verse 8 are part of the inclusio of that first section. And now, beginning verse 9, let me hear what the El Adonai will speak. For God will speak peace, shalom, to God's people and devotees, that they do not return to folly. And so the bridge to the future redemption is listening to God speaking. And some understand this as prophetic or knowing, kind of knowing God's key message, which is to listen to God. That first and foremost. And that, of course, is very big. What it is that we're supposed to listen to. But to listen to a being who is the creator and who cares about justice will stop folly. The word folly here, kisla, is also used for self-confidence, usually overwhelmingly translated as folly, but the commentators will point out that the confidence is self-reliance. The folly is the sense of being overly confident, kisla, that you are not dependent on God, that you are not accountable. Verse 10, surely close to those that fear God. So if you are a yirat shamayim, a fearer of heaven, of God, then God will deliver. And God's glory, kavod yishkon, will dwell. And the word yishkon has a greater quality of permanence. So that, again, this back and forth of a cycle of closeness and distance will be completed when we listen to God and have God with awe. And now this line that is such an important part of art in the Middle Ages. Let me show you some of the art. So this art piece is by John August Swanson. This is a collage of all these elements. It was done for the Catholic Church in Los Angeles. He's a contemporary artist, John August Swanson. And he said, growing up in the Catholic Church, when every year they would read Psalm 85, which is the title of this piece, he would feel a quality of joy. And this is, again, because the concluding verses point toward a future of harmony. And here you have kindness and truth meeting. In the Middle Ages, it was a very popular painting, and I picked just from the Justice and Peace of Kiss. Remarkably, the Justice and Peace tend to be seen as women, and here's some images. So those rare images of women kissing in medieval art. Here, for instance, is Tiapolo of Justice and Peace. So that those verses are popular verses because they paint a portrait or a picture of kindness and truth have met, justice and peace have kissed, truth from the earth springs forth, and justice from heaven has looked down. Now, you might think at first impression that that's all very sweet, but let me show you an example of where or how the rabbis quote this in a surprising way. So righteousness and peace, instead of kissed each other, you see, in this midrash I'm going to read to you, they have combated each other. The word nishika, kiss, is sometimes, consider the story of Jacob and Esau, Genesis 33:4. The two brothers have been separated for 20 years. Jacob's very nervous about reuniting from the brother whose birthright he has stolen. And the verse reads, V'yaratz Esav likrato, and Esav ran to greet him, Vayichapakehu, and they hugged, V'yipal al tzavarav, and he fell on his neck, Vayishakehu, and there's dots over this that the Masoretes put on, Vayivku, and they cried. And so normally, and most translations would have Vayishakehu as, and they kissed. But Rashi, for instance, will say there's two different interpretations. One is instead of nashak, it's nashach. He bit him. And there's a midrash how he bit his neck and he broke his teeth because his neck turned into marble. That's the sense that the two brothers still had conflict between them. And the other understanding is, no, it was a kiss. And Rashi will say the other understanding that Esav's latent love broke through. But look at this midrash from Genesis Rabbah 8:5. Rabbi Shimon said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, came to create Adam, this is a comment on Genesis 1:26. The ministering angels formed themselves into groups and parties, some of them saying, let him be created, while others urged him, let him not be created. Thus it is written. Now our verse. Love and truth fought together. Righteousness and peace combated each other. Love said, let him be created because he will dispense acts of love. Truth said, let him not be created because he has compounded a falsehood. Righteousness said, let him be created because he will perform righteous deeds. Peace said, let him not be created because he is full of strife. What did the Holy One do? He took truth and cast it to the ground. That's a famous midrash. And I'm delighted to link it and see the verse that it's linked to. And it does this play that you can't be too much involved sometimes with truth or nothing will get done, which leads to another midrash on Psalm 85. And that is when it says here that kindness and truth have met, the midrash is Exodus Rabbah 5:10, that's a reference to Aaron and Moses reuniting, that Aaron represents kindness, and here they are meeting and they are kissing, by the way. So leaving that midrash aside, that's only to share with you it's not always simple, and there's room for even opposite understandings at times. But overwhelmingly, this is understood in its most common literal understanding of meeting and kissing. And so Midrash Rabbah will say, Aaron is the one who, Ohev Shalom v'rodev Shalom. The rabbis would say of Aaron, he loved peace and pursued peace. He is kindness, he's chesed, flexible and compassionate, while Moses is emet. He's truth, firm standards, clear values, and leadership required that the two of them work in tandem. That the journey through the desert, the rabbis will again comment, required the blending of kindness and truth and justice and peace to kiss. So this quality of truth, Ahuva Ho is an important scholar who's often with us in regard to Sephania, a less known prophet who's an important prophet, time of that first exile, predicting that future redemption, and will say, the remnant of Israel, this is Zephaniah 3:13, shall do no iniquity, nor speak lies, neither shall deceitful language be found in their mouth. So that comment of Zephaniah is picked up in the commentaries to say that for Israel to endure on the land, it needs to be with four divine attributes: kindness and truth, justice and peace, if they are to endure. And that's what Sforno will say, and Rashi will say, that if the people are to remain in the land, then they must have these four qualities of righteousness. One last kind of homily, and then the last verse. And that's verse 12. Truth from the earth springs forth. So truth comes from the earth. It's this quality of the land will be fertile. We'll see that in verse 13. But verse 12, truth itself must come forth from the earth. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, 1700 to 1760, only had daughters, but his grandsons became well known, and one of them was named Moshe Chaim Ephraim. And he didn't write, he was very modest, unlike his brother, who was more, the other grandson, more confident in his ways. But after he died, Moshe Chaim Ephraim left a manuscript behind that his son would publish, named the Degel Menacha Ephraim, that is an important teacher on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, because this grandson grew up with his grandfather. And he writes in reference to verse 12 in that book that to perceive truth requires humility, entailing self-criticism and ignoring pride. Only when a person lowers himself to the ground can truth sprout forth. So again, a nice homily in terms of the need for humility in order for truth to emerge. The last, and then you get verse 13. The land is productive, there is stability. This is a messianic future of justice and harmony and prosperity. The good here of verse 13, Rashi and others will define as rain. The final verse is that Hebrew obscurity. Particularly, it's the second half, because as you know, in Hebrew, for pronouns, you don't know if it's capital or not. So the first part, everybody says, justice before God shall walk. That's more or less uniform, though it's justice before him, he will walk. But what I put in parentheses, particularly the second phrase, has three possibilities. God sets forth a path for God's steps, or righteousness, which is now personified, sets forth a path for God's steps. Or the third possibility, he, the righteous person, sets forth a path for his steps, following the path of God. All three are possibilities, but what is clear is that justice, tzedek, also translated as righteousness, here is personified as the heralder, the one who announces that God is coming, or if you will, points to God's path. For the summary of this psalm is ambiguity. Is it talking about God? Is it talking about justice or the just person? And ultimately, the poetry is that it's talking about all three simultaneously. That when it's a world in which kindness and truth meet, and justice and peace kiss, in which truth springs from the earth and justice from heaven looks down, then it is justice, tzedek, righteousness, that allows the stability of a relationship with God, that allows for a harmony with those within creation, that it allows for a direction to maintain a constancy of movement. This particular psalm is recommended traditionally to those who wish to express gratitude, to those who have needs for livelihood, and finally, to anyone seeking relief from trouble. And so with that, I'm delighted now to remove the text to be able to see our 24 screens, to have people from far and wide. Let's take some of your reactions. Again, our study today is honoring Jackie Wolf in honor of her anniversary and her birthday. Any comments or questions about Psalm 85? Oh, I am glad to see you, Ahuva. Whenever I read a Safanya quote, I think of you. Ahuva did her doctoral dissertation in Bible on who is the author of Safanya. No? No. She's correcting me. Go ahead, Ahuva. No. Okay. Any comments on Psalm 85? So, Julia, go ahead. Julia.
Well, I'm always interested in tabulations of virtues. And for the ancient Greeks, the four cardinal virtues were justice, temperance, prudence, and something else, which I'm forgetting, courage. Courage, justice, prudence, and moderation. Are these kindness, truth, righteousness, and peace? Do these come up elsewhere as a kind of set of four? Is this logic developed? Is it, or, with Maimonides being an Aristotelian, does he develop these four in relationship to the Greek cardinal virtues? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm fascinated by the question. In the study first for this psalm, I didn't see any commentaries that address that issue. What I did see is in Christian commentaries, these four qualities of kindness, truth, justice, and peace are often particularly pulled out as the four attributes.
Uh-huh.
What's interesting, I mean, we do get some of these qualities of chesed ve'emet. Those two often go together. They are a formula often repeated as the attributes of God in particular. But tzedek and v'shalom, I don't at least come to mind. There is the statement in Pirkei Avot about the three, foundations of the earth, but those relate to justice and peace. Um, and so I don't see a direct link in terms of how they get developed. Other than as in this case, what is interesting in contrast to Greek, these four descriptions are the four qualities of God. So that God is identified with chesed ve'emet, kindness and truth, and that kind of tension between them. God's identified with tzedek and with v'shalom. And what we're asking for is that we should embody these four divine qualities. And as for, prudence, courage, temperance, those are not necessarily qualities that we would address to God. We would assume God is courageous, for instance. God doesn't have to show that, even though God can, or prudence. So again, what's different about the biblical, these are four things that define God's core nature, that define the final redemption, where God will be manifest more fully.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kanner Shula.
In verse 13, I can't help but observe that everything else in all the other verses, God's deeds or whatever happens are always very specific. Talks about chesed ve'emet, and then emet me'eretz titzmach, v'tzedek mishamayim. But 13, suddenly there is a line only, Gam Adonai yiten hatov, which is so general, totally unspecific. And then it goes back to specific, the Artsenu titen yevula. And it just seems like poetically to not be directly in concert with the style elsewhere, where there are very specific values and things that are mentioned. Tov seems so general.
So that's a very good insight, in that in the flow that begins with verse 9, it's like, let me hear your voice, God. Because when I hear your voice, that's verse 9, that's the bridge. Then I will not return to my folly, right? So this is spiritual. And then these four qualities that then get reinforced in terms of verse 12. And now, as Kanner Shula mentions, there's now this concretization seemingly in 13 of physical good. How come? And the rabbis will say often in describing the Messianic era that it indeed, when the world is in harmony, then physical goodness will also be present. So back to Julia's question right before about Maimonides. Maimonides will say regarding the Messianic era, Maimonides is a bit of a rationalist. For him, the Messiah is a human being who will live and die, for instance. He's not like Nachmanides, a superhuman. But he's going to be so wise, the king, that he will point the way for how people can live in harmony. So for Maimonides, when it says that the wolf and the lamb will live together, that means the fierce and the mild will coexist. So again, it's a metaphor. But Maimonides will say that because there is peace, there will be physical prosperity. And because there will be physical prosperity, people will have the time and the inclination to be engaged with the divine. That the physical is both the reward for right thinking and the precondition for it to flourish. And so the rabbis will say in regard to verse 13, as you point out, Cantor Shula, it moves to the physical as prosperity. Though I mentioned in passing that throughout the Bible, a couple of examples, Deuteronomy 28:12, Leviticus 26:3, there's the sense that if you follow my way, I will give rain in its season. And so Rashi and Ibn Ezra, those early medieval commentators, will define the good as rain for the land of Israel, that the rain will be plentiful just as promised when you follow my ways. To pull this together, is there one last comment that anybody might have, and then I'll have that and pull it together? Irene, did you have a comment?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind. I'm really
No.
trying to be. I've written a book on Ibn Ezra, and he actually died in 1164
Yes.
on the way to York, which is next door to Leeds, where the birthday girl's relations, where her mother was born, which is in Yorkshire. And I'm just in negotiation with the Archbishop of York, because we don't have your history of interfaith that you have in America that I found. So Ibn Ezra, a lot of people have said he died in 1167, but there was a conference in 1989. I was very young and I was invited, and it's been my life's work, Ibn Ezra. I'm so thrilled by, if you don't mind me saying, by your approach and the standard of your congregants. I just cannot believe it, compared to so it's 1164, because we know he died at 75 and he was born in 1089 in Tudela in northern Spain. People think it's Toledo, but Tudela. Anyway, I've written a book. I just thought I'd say on him.
Well, we're really honored, Irene from Manchester, to have one. I'm
very honored, because to have something on Maimonides and Greek from, an early morning is quite extraordinary. You don't even get that at university here anymore, where I taught. I think you're marvelous. I hope you don't mind me saying. And I think your translation is better than Robert Alter. He's very good at literature, but you have to keep with the shuv business, the restoration, as well as all the other things. I think you're an amazing translator. I'm saying it because, nobody's a prophet in their own land, and, maybe your own colleagues don't realize, and I just love it. Absolutely.
I'm really honored, Irene. I'm so delighted. And I've now corrected my text that Ibn Ezra died in 1164 instead of 1167. So I'll close in honor of that insight from Irene and the work that she's done as a scholar, to say that Ibn Ezra, as I noted at the beginning, sees this as the Psalm of Exile. And the word in verse 6 of Hal-Olam, unendingly will you be incensed with us, is because he is now 1,000 years as a part of a people in exile, looking particularly to these closing verses as the time promised of harmony, of a ingathering in which, I will add, it is not just Israel that will be in harmony, but the whole world, as this image of the future is an image of God as creator, enabling completion of creation. And with that, gratitude to each who participated It's been a treat for me to honor Jackie Wolf and to wish her a happy birthday and a happy anniversary. I invite those honoring the memory of a loved one to do so through the saying of Kaddish to complete our study. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah
Amen.
ba'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchayei l'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi Rabba mevarach le'olam u'me'omaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dikudja barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran v'yoma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi Lama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'yokol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom B'imrumav Uya Aseh Shalom Aleinu V'yokol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen. Thanks again to each of you. Jackie Wolf, happy anniversary. Nice to dedicate today's learning. Tomorrow we dedicate our learning to Phyllis Abrams, Psalm 86, entitled, There Is None Like You. It's the beginning of our Torah service. Ein kamocha va'Elohim is taken from tomorrow's psalm. I'll look to see you then, same time, same place.